The recent passing of Queen Elizabeth II marks the end of an era from 1952 to 2022. And so this is a good point to look at how the UK economy has changed and transformed itself over the past 70 years. We will look at all the improvements in the economy and all the challenges that still remain. Are things significantly better than back in the 1950s? Or do we just have a different set of problems? So first of all, a good place to start off with is with basic living standards. Back in 1952, the average income in real terms was £7,500 a year. 70 years later, that has almost quadrupled to £32,000 per person. So it's a very significant improvement in living standards, and that's reflected in the amount of consumer durables that we're able to enjoy. Computers, mobile phones, or many types of goods that weren't even available back in the 1950s. In fact, in 1950, only 1% of the UK population had a TV. And the Queen's own coronation back in 1952, of course, helped to increase this. But by the mid-1960s, nearly a quarter of the population had a TV, and this would continue to rise. But also, labour-saving technology such as washing machines really transformed society and enabled women to have much more free time or to be able to go out and work. Yet, despite the very tangible increase in living standards, we still, in 2022, see many people facing a real cost of living crisis. How is it that despite all this increase in wealth and output, we still face these problems of poverty and cost of living? Well, since the 2007 crisis, the post-war economic growth has really slowed down. There's been a slowdown in productivity that's characterised the 50s, 60s and 70s. And this has led to a stagnating of real wages. And with a present inflation above wage increases, this has caused a lot of problems. But anyway, to go back to the comparison of 1952, another huge improvement that's happened in the past 70 years is the health of the population. In 1952, life expectancy was around 69. 70 years later, that has increased to 81. And other indexes like life expectancy for infants has improved. So the infant mortality rate has fallen from 29 per thousand to just 3.4 per thousand. And this improvement in health is caused by quite a few factors, not least the creation of the NHS in 1947, offering free healthcare at the point of use. Also, health has been improved by advances in medical technology and the economic growth that has helped reduce absolute poverty. And yet, despite all the huge increases in spending on healthcare, we still face a lot of serious health problems, with life expectancy stopping its past growth and stagnating in the past few years, with the NHS under increasing pressure as more people have different kinds of sickness and diseases that were not around 60 or 70 years ago. A major issue in 1952 was air quality, because in 1952 London, like other European cities, suffered from a great smog, which really caused tremendous problems for the city, causing in the region of 16,000 deaths and many more people suffering lifelong problems. And this was a combination of the huge amounts of burning coal and also a freak weather. But this great smog caused the government to try and do something about it. And in 1956, they passed the Clean Air Act, one of the pioneering new forms of environmental legislation, which banned the burning of coal in many cities. And this has led to an improvement in air quality. But the growth in motor traffic and other forms of pollution mean that although the smog, the visible pollution, is not there, it is estimated around 97% of households face unacceptable levels of air pollution according to World Health Organization guidelines. So it's still a problem all these years later, just not as visible. And looking back to 1952, it's hard to imagine just how important the coal industry was. Transport was still dominated by trains, which were all run on coal-powered engines, and the main form of electricity generation was coal as well. In the region of 700,000 miners worked in the coal industry. In 2022, that number is just around 1,000. And so this past 70 years has seen a huge change in UK industry, UK manufacturing, and the structure of the economy. So, for example, in 1952, the Bank of England reported that around 33% of the GDP was due to manufacturing. 70 years later, that has fallen to less than 9%. The UK, which used to be a pioneer of manufacturing for the world, is now primarily a service sector based economy based on finance, insurance, and retail services. Going back to the environment, although there's been some improvement in air quality and a very interesting reduction in CO2 emissions, and you can see how the decline of the coal industry and the move to other forms of energy has shown a very significant fall in CO2 emissions in the UK. And yet, despite this, the UK is perhaps increasingly aware of the global environmental issues such as global warming and rising sea levels and loss of natural habitat. And when the former Prince of Wales raised environmental issues back in the 1970s, he was really much of an outlier, not a very popular topic at all. But come to 2022, we're increasingly aware of the huge potential economic and social cost of environmental problems. And going forward into the next age, the environment and making sure it's sustainable for future generations will be one of the great challenges, just as it was back in 1952. In fact, now it's perhaps even more of a challenge because of the growth in the global population, growth in living standards, and the huge amount of pollution that occurs across the globe. Another interesting statistic to look at is national debt. In 1952, national debt was 162% of GDP, and that is a huge amount by present modern standards. But the interesting thing is, it was already on quite a steep decline. National debt peaked at over 240% of GDP in the late 40s because the UK was bankrupt after the Second World War and also trying to spend so much on setting up the NHS and welfare state. But the golden years of the 1950s and 60s saw rapid economic growth, really helped to reduce debt as a percentage of GDP quite dramatically. And this wasn't because of spending cuts and higher taxes. It was purely from economic growth leading to higher tax revenues. And you can see how national debt as a share of GDP fell quite dramatically from that 240% to around 40% in the mid 2000s. But today, debt is kind of on a different trajectory. It's been steadily increasing in recent years, first from a global financial crisis, and then COVID has pushed national debt up to 100% of GDP or just below. But with the energy crisis leading to a huge government bailout, national debt is forecast to soar, to really increase over the next few decades, because we have all these pressures on government spending, but we don't have the same rates of economic growth we did in the early age of the Elizabethan era of the 50s and the 60s. In 1952, Britain, it's fair to say, was a very class-conscious society, a lot of inequality, and in those 70 years, some of this inequality has been reduced. For example, in 1952, the top 1% owned about 48% of a country's wealth. By 2022, this had fallen to around 21%, so quite a significant fall in wealth inequality. But if we look at income inequality, the picture is more mixed. Now, in the 50s and 60s, income inequality did fall, partly helped by strong trade unions increasing the wages of workers, with quite a lot of restraint amongst top executives. But from the 1980s, we see a very sharp rise in inequality as the lowest income saw little growth, but those at the top did very well. And so the gains of income inequality, which improved in the 50s and 60s, has gone into reverse, especially in the 1980s. If we look at the numbers of people attending university, some quite striking numbers. Back in 1952, just 23,000 women were in university education. In 2022, this number was around 1.57 million women. Men, not quite as dramatic increase. It was 78,000 in 1952 and is now 1.1 million. So this shows two things: the rise in higher education, and in particular the greater opportunities available to women now than compared to the 1950s. However, whilst the UK has done well at expanding university access, we have lagged behind in vocational training, with the UK facing skill shortages in areas like plumbing and electricians. And compared to France and Germany and other European countries, the amount of vocational training we offer is very limited compared to our competitors. What about inflation? Well, it was an interesting parallel, because back in 1952, inflation was running at 10%, and a large cause was a cost-push inflation resulting from the Korean War, which caused a surge in demand for commodities. There was also quite strong economic growth in the early 50s. But as the Korean War ended in 1953, that inflation quickly fell, and it was around 2 or 3% for most of the 50s and 60s. So here in 2022, again we've got a similar inflation rate, just below 10%, again due to cost-push factors, rising oil prices, exacerbated by the Ukrainian war. I think the difference is that perhaps inflation now is a bit more sustained, a bit more embedded, and also, unfortunately, wages are not keeping up with inflation like they were in the 1950s. So whether inflation will fall as quickly as it did in 1953, I'm not sure. But it's an interesting kind of parallel to 70 years ago. Also a similar story with unemployment. Back in 1952, unemployment was very low, 2%, very close to full employment. And in 2022, despite all the economic problems we have, we've actually got very low unemployment, around 3%. And in fact, in the 50s, when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, the UK was actually suffering from a worker shortage. And this led to the government encouraging immigration from Commonwealth countries, such as the West Indies, India, Pakistan. And this led to the new generation of immigrants from abroad, which changed the UK both culturally, socially and economically. In fact, the biggest levels of net migration occurred in the 90s and 2000s, when free movement of labour in Europe led to a big increase in migrants from abroad. This net migration has been one factor in the growth of the UK population, which has increased from around 50 million in 1952 to the present level of 68 million. And this has brought both benefits in terms of higher output, but also issues such as congestion and shortage of housing. And in fact, if we look at housing, it's a very stark statistic. Of course, house prices have surged in the past 70 years. Back in 1952, the average house was just £1,800. Today, the average house is in the region of £270,000. And even accounting for inflation, house prices have increased astronomically. Now, initially, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, rates of home ownership increased quite a lot. They were around 35% in 1939, but in the 50s and 60s, rising incomes coupled with an increased supply of housing led to a growth in home ownership, as many people were able to buy a house for the first time. And home ownership rates peaked at around 70% in the early 2000s. But then declining affordability has meant that home ownership has fallen, as many young people are unable to get onto the property ladder. and the home ownership rate has now fallen to 63%. And whereas in the early 50s, you could easily get a house 3 times average incomes, today, average house prices are at least 7 times average incomes, which makes it very difficult for many young people to buy a house. And this explains, going back to an earlier point, why despite this huge rise in income, that some people don't feel better off. Because yes, it's true that average incomes have risen, but for some people without the wealth or the ability to buy a house, they face very high living costs. And so their practical existence is unfortunately still struggling to get by. The past 70 years of Queen Elizabeth have seen enormous change, and we can't hide from the fact that the UK has seen a very significant decline in its relative international importance. It kind of mirrors the decline of the British Empire and the decline in the importance of the economy. And nothing shows this better than the value of a pound. In 1949, just before the Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, the pound was trading at over $4 per pound. But then in 49 was a devaluation to $2.8. And in the intervening decades, the pound has steadily fallen to its present level of just $1.2 per pound. And this reflects the fact that the UK economy has shown lower productivity growth than our main competitors, higher inflation, and also a decline in the international importance of the UK economy. The past 70 years have seen really remarkable changes in the UK economy. There have been definitely positive changes with huge increases in income and the deployment of some labour-saving technology like washing machines and vacuum cleaners, which have really freed up a lot of leisure time for people. Yet despite the big increases in income and rising living standards, many people don't feel the improvement in living standards that we might expect because of the housing costs of living, and continued inequality that makes some people struggle to deal with the cost of living. We are very grateful to the Queen's service for the past 70 years, a real beacon of stability and kindness towards the country, and she'll be very sorely missed. And from an economic point of view, well, the Queen had really very little to do with it directly, but the Elizabethan age has really seen very remarkable changes in the past 70 years. So I hope you liked this video, with plenty more coming out soon.